Thanks so much, and thank everyone for being here. I understand you haven't been forced to come here. You're all here voluntarily, which is pretty amazing. So I'll try to make it worth your while, and I'll try to speak as briefly and concisely as possible so that we'll have time for discussion. You heard the title? I'm assuming that's why you're here. The title is Myth of Civilizations, ? Islam in Global Perspective. And I was inspired to write about this by 3 events from the year 2018 that I thought were particularly strangely overlapping. First is that in November, Euro-America celebrated the centenary of the conclusion of World War I, which had been called the Great War for some reason, but had to be renamed because just a few years later, another even more hideous and expansive war occurred. So it became World War I. In May of 2018, Richard Pipes, at age 94, died. Richard Pipes, the famous Polish-American Cold War historian of Russia. And 2 days later, British-American historian Bernard Lewis died at nearly 102 years of age. Lewis, who coined the phrase clash of civilizations 3 years before American political scientist Samuel Huntington made the phrase infamous and laid the foundations for today's ongoing global war on terror. And tonight I want to draw connections among those 3, suggesting that the Great War that morphed into World War II because of unfinished business still is not over, and that the global war on terror is itself a residual effect of the Great War's unfinished business, and argue that today's ongoing wars against terror are further than ever from resolution, at least in part, because of the way the conflicts have been framed by politically influential scholars like Pipes, Lewis, and Huntington. Overall, I suggest that the post-World War I framing of conflicts as fundamentally ideological, under the influence of Pipes, Lewis, and Huntington, is deceptive and dangerously self-replicating. It obfuscates the core grievances of specific communities, political grievances that are actually at the root of the conflicts and that must be addressed in order to approach resolution of the conflicts. In other words, the wars that continue to plague our planet are not fundamentally ideological in nature. They are not wars over ideas, but over power and resources, and ultimately of people's perceptions of their rights. And the sooner we collectively recognize that, the sooner we can stop trying to fight ideas with weapons and focus instead on building healthy communities. I want to start with some background on the arbitrary nature of historical framing, historical periodization, in order to draw attention to the novel nature of Pipes, Lewis's, and Huntington's ideological framing of both history and conflict. As we all know, the framing of historical periods changes over time. In the late 17th century, a little-known German philosopher, Christoph Salarius, noticed that major intellectual changes were occurring in Europe, and they were having profound impacts on politics. Following the upheavals of the Protestant Reformation, rationalist philosophers were challenging the absolute authority of the church to determine what was true. Reason was challenging religion. Salarius seemed to recognize that this was the beginning of the end of religiously legitimated imperial dynasties. New bases of political legitimacy were emerging, no longer from above, but from below, from the people, the people. We'll get back to that issue. Until that time, history had commonly been framed as a series of great reigns named for the rulers, the era of the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, the age of Charlemagne, the Tudor period, etc. Salarius introduced a new way of framing history. Instead of just a succession of rulers or reigns, regnal history, Salarius presented history as a succession of time periods. The ancient world had given way to the medieval. He was the one who gave those names. And now a new or modern period was emerging. This new or modern period, as he called it, would see the emergence of new political structures, Europe's and America's democratic revolutions, and the modern scientific and technological developments that catapulted their industrializing economies to global dominance. Formerly marginalized subjects were becoming empowered, both economically and politically. They were becoming citizens. Of course, the calendar continued to reflect the regnal years, and as it still does, the year of our Lord, Lord and Master. But historians and philosophers spoke of the modern era. Salarius's modern period was Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. Humans were becoming the masters of their fate, it seemed. Not the church, not the king. Things seemed to be looking up. We were so brilliant, we could manage our own affairs, we thought. But economic downturns in the late 19th century, the crumbling of the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires, and rising social conflicts, social tensions, together began to challenge that Enlightenment optimism. And for many people, the Great War finished it. That's when German philosopher Oswald Spengler popularized yet another way of framing history. In his 1918 paradigm setting, The Decline of the West, history doesn't fit Salarius's linear trajectory. Instead, it's a succession of rise and decline of cultures and civilizations. What Spengler called high cultures inevitably become fully fledged civilizations. He's making all this up, of course. This language corresponds to nothing in reality, but this was the framing. High cultures give way to fully fledged civilizations and then go into decline. So it's perfectly natural. He named several examples, including what he called Magian civilization. That was ancient Persian, Jewish, and Muslim civilization. The Apollonian was classical Greco-Roman civilization, and then there was Faustian. Faustian was modern Western civilization. Faustian civilization. Each civilization, and here's the most important part, each civilization was distinct, you see, distinct. Each had its own identity and its own characteristics, separate from all the others. In his view, Western civilization was in its twilight years. It had reached its creative climax and was now just expanding its power. And for him, that was a sure sign of imminent decline. Spengler did offer some interesting insights into various things, but the problematic aspect of his framing was the segregation of societies into discrete civilizational blocks. Sheer invention. discrete civilizational blocks. That framing then was taken up and popularized. You see, this Great War was a horrendous trauma to these formerly confident Enlightenment types. It was popularized by probably 20th century's greatest historian, or at least most popular, Arnold Toynbee. But more importantly, it came to be replicated in universities. Institutionalization of intellectual fantasy. As early as the 18th century, many universities had established departments to study the languages and religions of communities east of the Danube that they encountered in their age of discovery, another intellectual fantasy. The Europeans were discovering all these people who didn't know they were lost. They were being discovered by the Europeans, and so the Europeans needed to study them. The Near East, the Middle East, the Far East, collectively the East, the Orient, Orientalism. Oriental studies were born. In the mid-20th century, Orientalism, Oriental studies, began to give way to area studies programs. How did that work? During the Second World War, actually the Great War 2.0, of course, Soviet Russia was an important ally of Britain, France, and the US, the Allies. But following the defeat of the Axis powers, the Soviet Union, overnight, became the Allies' arch nemesis. From trusted ally to arch nemesis. The capitalist countries were desperately afraid that the socialists, bless you, the socialists would spread their ideology, especially in the countries newly liberated from empire, the so-called Third World. And then, in that process, block the capitalists' unfettered access to profit. In this context, Western Europe and American universities perceived the need for scholars who would be able to monitor the new enemy. Expansive, godless communism. That was the new enemy. Not Soviet Russia. Expansive, godless communism. Thus were born Soviet studies, and then Asian studies, Middle East studies, African studies, Latin American studies, along with any number of subdivisions, sub-regional studies. So civilizational block world history, regional compartmentalization, was reinforced in universities in area studies. There were historians, of course, brilliant historians, who challenged that compartmentalization, who argued that in reality, various regions' histories intersect in fundamental ways. Most notably, Marshall G.S. Hodgson, University of Chicago, argued that the dividing line between the European West and the Middle East is entirely arbitrary. The Eastern Mediterranean has been a global crossroads, as has Central Asia, from the dawn of written history, sharing languages, economies, religions, arts, architecture, even food throughout the ages. Hodgson even questioned the continental divisions between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Instead, he suggested Afro-Eurasia, demonstrating that all our contemporary heritages, complexly interrelated, are traceable to that richly interconnected context, the Indian Ocean basin, in effect. Nevertheless, regional compartmentalization gained the upper hand in universities and, most importantly for this discussion, became politicized. And that brings us to our famous recently deceased scholars. Harvard Russia historian Pipes, Richard Pipes, was a Holocaust survivor. His family fled Poland as Nazis invaded. Pipes was convinced, if you read his memoirs, He was convinced that his life had been spared in order to spread a moral message. That message, in his own words, that evil ideas lead to evil consequences. The Nazis' fascist ideology was the core of their evil, he said, and after the Nazis' defeat, a new evil ideology had arisen to threaten the God-fearing West, communism. Pipes self-consciously dedicated his life to combating it. But that combat was not just academic. Pipes served as senior advisor to the US military and CIA. In the 1980s, he directed the Eastern and European and Soviet Affairs section of the US National Security Council under President Reagan, insisting that the Soviet Union must be dealt with harshly. No compromise is possible because the Soviet Union is based on an evil ideology. Princeton's Bernard Lewis was also instrumental in politicizing civilizational bloc compartmentalization although his focus was on Islam. As I mentioned, it was Lewis who coined the phrase clash of civilizations. That was in a 1990 article in The Atlantic titled "The Roots of Muslim Rage." Clearly segregating the West from an essentialized Islam, Lewis sought to explain, quote, why so many Muslims deeply resent the West and why their bitterness will not easily be mollified. In the article, he refers to Christendom as a distinctive civilization in competition, I'm not making this up, he did, in competition with Islam, an essentialized Islam. Islam and Europe are rival systems, he said. Again, reflecting Spengler's usage, Lewis tried to explain the decline of Islamic civilization in a 2002 book called What Went Wrong. And notice the terminology. It's not the decline of the power of the Ottomans or the Safavids or the Mughals or any of the empires or any of the other governments that were undermined by European colonial philandering. Lewis's subject was the decline of a unitary civilization that he called Islamic. According to Lewis, Muslims are anti-West, you see, in part because of imported Nazi and communist ideologies. Those are evil, we know that. But there was something even deeper in Muslims' anti-Westernism, he said. It wasn't the various grievances of formerly colonized people, for example, such as occupation of territory or foreign support for autocratic powers. No, that's not the problem. In the 1990 article, Lewis said, deeper than any other grievance is this, in his words, what is truly evil and unacceptable to Muslims is the domination by infidels. That's really what they don't like. It's not that they don't like autocrats. It's they just don't like infidel autocrats. There's a distinction there. A false distinction, but it's a distinction that he's trying to make. Never mind the strangeness of this claim. What I want you to notice is that the idea that there are distinct civilizational blocks that share virtually nothing in common has become an unquestioned assumption. This is Bernard Lewis at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies until after he was 100 years old. There's no retirement age there. He was literally at work, not teaching, they didn't have to teach there, but at work after he was 100 years old. In this vision, Islam has become an essentialized unity. There is no nuance, no accounting for diversity based on ethnic, cultural, sectarian, gender, class, ideological, or national identities among Muslims. From Rohingya and Uyghur Muslims to rural societies in sub-Saharan Africa or Central Asia, to urban elites in Indonesia, India, Turkey, Tunisia, the United Kingdom, the US. Apparently all Muslims, nearly a quarter of the world's population today, apparently all these Muslims think alike. You see, they share a single defining ideology. And again, these unquestioned identities, this essentialized, homogenized, assumed ideology is politicized. In Lewis's obituary in the New York Times last May, the claim was made, and it's an accurate one as far as I can tell. Few outsiders and no academics had more influence with the Bush administration on Middle Eastern affairs than Mr. Lewis. The president carried a marked-up copy of one of Lewis's articles in his briefing papers and met with him before and after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Mr. Lewis gave briefings at the White House, the residence of Vice President Dick Cheney, and at the Pentagon under Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. Harvard's Samuel Huntington, who lived only to age 81, died in 2008, epitomizes both the essentialization of Islam as an ideology and its politicization, beginning with his iconic 1993 Foreign Affairs essay, The Clash of Civilisations. It's there that Huntington first claimed, quoting, "The fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future." He said, Huntington's claim was in response to the ideas put forward by one of his students, Francis Fukuyama, that the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 meant that now all countries could follow the Euro-American capitalist model. And that would mark the end of history. That was the title of Fukuyama's best-selling post-Soviet 1992 book, The End of History. No more toggling back and forth between freedom and bondage. The world had finally fully evolved. I'm going to quote Fukuyama. He said, and this actually got published, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. The end of history as such, that is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." Only a political scientist could get by with publishing such a thing. But again, the submerged premise, the root of the Cold War conflicts, and perhaps all previous conflicts, was ideological. It was ideas. It was all about ideas. We don't like your ideas. People didn't fight because they were hungry or oppressed or dispossessed. They fight because of ideas. And now that the Soviet Union's dark ideological shadow had passed, everyone could organize themselves on the basis of Euro-American ideas. They were all free to be just like us. This dreamlike view was floated during the heady days following the collapse of the West's Darth Vader, the USSR. That collapse caught, of course, the policy world by surprise, preoccupied as they were with theorizing and strategizing against it. For a brief spell, then President George Herbert Walker Bush even speculated about a peace dividend. Just think what benefits would result from redirecting the Cold War's massive military spending to civilian needs. But that's when Huntington shot back. That's precisely when Huntington shot back. Do not allow yourselves to be lulled into complacency. The West may have defeated Nazi fascism and Soviet communism, but there remains another formidable ideological enemy, Islam. Specific Muslim majority countries? No. Specific political grievances? No. No. Economic disputes? No, that didn't seem to fit the bill. Islamic civilization. Islamic civilization, more specifically what he perceived as Islam's distinctive single unitary ideology. That is what the West had to be prepared to fight. Now, details about this specific distinctive Islamic ideology? Well, he's a theoretician. Details. The ones offered by Huntington would surprise many Muslims. The uniqueness of Islamic civilization, said Huntington, this civilization that has nothing in common with Judeo-Christian civilization in his view, completely distinct with its ideas, unique values and ideals, completely at odds with those of the West. Here's its uniqueness. Western ideals of individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, human rights, equality, liberty, rule of law, democracy, free markets, and separation of church and state, these have little resonance in Islamic civilization, in Islamic cultures. Also, the same, he said, Islamic civilization was the new arch enemy, but there were other backups just in case, because also Confucian, Japanese, Hindu, Buddhist, and Orthodox cultures also didn't have resonance with these uniquely Western values. Now, where he learned his version of Islamic values is difficult to discern. Obviously, he hadn't studied them. There's no evidence of these ideas in classical Islamic sources. Of course, again, his degrees are in theory. But based on his novel theories, Huntington concludes that it's no wonder Muslim majority countries lag behind, those are his words, European countries in economic and political development. Not because they were actually colonized, economically and politically exploited by European countries for decades, and in some cases centuries, although he acknowledges that that happened. But that's not really the problem. They're backwards because Islamic culture doesn't value the things that the European colonizers deprived them of. Muslims just don't seem to want economic and political development, despite what Professor Lewis had just said was the basis of their being enraged. They were enraged because the Europeans deprived them of those. But now Huntington takes it a step further and says, no, they didn't value them in the first place. His reasoning reminds me very much of this poem, a little-known poem by a very well-known physicist, Edward Teller. Do you know Edward Teller? The father of the hydrogen bomb. See if you've heard this poem. I'm sure you haven't, because his son gave it to me. That's how come I have it. It hasn't been published, as far as I know. A fact without a theory is like a ship without a sail, a boat without a rudder, a kite without a tail. A fact without a theory is an inconclusive act. But if there's one thing worse in this confusing universe, it's a theory without a fact. Imagine what a few facts would have done for Professor Huntington. He says that civilizations are distinguished fundamentally by religions. most fundamentally, he says. But he refers to Western civilization as Judeo-Christian. Well, that's interesting. It's a bit of a neologism, isn't it? A post-World War II neologism. Have Judaism and Christianity become a single religion? Was it not Christians who tried to eradicate Jews on the basis of religious arguments? And what might Professor Huntington have made, if he'd ever looked at the Quran, of the Quran's calls for Muslims to remember the Torah and the Gospels, and its calls to Jews, Christians, and Muslims to come together since they all worship the same God and share the same values? Could Huntington really have been unaware that all Abrahamic scriptures stress human equality, the need for justice and mercy, and the negative effects of greed and tyranny? He's clearly unaware that Islamic legal scholars articulated specifically human rights using that phrase, hukukul ibad, hukukul insan, that phrase over 1,000 years ago, articulating specifically the sanctity of life, freedom of religion, and property rights, among others. And about that free trade that Muslims don't seem to value. He seems oblivious to the fact that the Mughal Empire in the 18th century was the most powerful economy in the world. It had eclipsed the Chinese imperial economy. And that strength was based primarily on international trade from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Major trading partner, England. Regarding governance, Huntington is also unaware that the Quran itself calls for consultative governance and governance by consent of the governed, and that Muslims have advocated democratic reform since the 19th century. Constitutional reforms were demanded in the Ottoman Empire and in Iran, it was known as Persia at the time, over 100 years ago, and were thwarted by the intervention of European and later American powers. I won't go on, but the point is that civilizational bloc historiography is based on theory that is unsupported by fact. Even more importantly, in its politicized form, civilizational bloc theory is downright dangerous for at least two reasons. One, yes, it focuses on the acts of terrorists. That has to be done. But framing our current GWAT, Global War on Terror, as ideological, not only unfairly casts suspicion on all Muslims as potential terrorists, but it also distracts us from focusing on the real sources of conflict, the core grievances shared by many formerly colonized people. People struggling under post-colonial conditions, disempowered economically, politically, socially, the conditions that oppress many and that give rise to radicalization among the few. As terrorism expert Mark Sageman notes, it is those core grievances that provide the context for radicalization. Ideology is an epiphenomenon. Radicalization needs no ideology. And in any case, militant ideologies are interchangeable. They catch popularity depending upon the context, depending upon what's circulating at the time. Without recognizing the core grievances that give rise to radicalization, we're highly unlikely to be able to address radicalization effectively, and may inadvertently exacerbate the very conditions that give rise to radicalization, as there is clear evidence that the global war on terror has done. Secondly, while many theorists have moved beyond, historians in particular have moved beyond Spengler and Huntington, the framing of conflict as civilizational that is at root ideological or religious, is at least as politically operative today as it was during the Cold War. Way back in the days after September 11th, the 2001 attacks, when President George W. Bush tried to answer his own question, why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? He came up with, this was his answer, delivered nationally. They hate our freedoms, he said. They hate our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. That was why the terrorist attacked, because they hate our freedoms. And what did he think that would be a good way to address that hatred? Launching a punishing war on the people of Afghanistan, none of whom was involved in the 9/11 attacks. And 2 years later, another war, this time on the people of Iraq, who also had absolutely nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. Since then, the global war on terror has expanded into 80 countries, most obviously Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan. And after more than 6 trillion US tax dollars spent, 500,000 killed directly as a result of the war, and several times as many indirectly, according to data recently reported by Brown University's Costs of War project, and the creation of the greatest refugee and internally displaced persons crisis since World War II, 21 million people and counting. Despite that, there are more terrorist organizations today than ever before, not fewer. Nevertheless, proponents of the Clash of Civilizations hypothesis continue to be politically empowered. Witness claims made by the US President's former senior counselor and National Security Council member Steve Bannon, currently quite active on this side of the Atlantic, I hear. At a 2014 meeting of conservative Roman Catholics in Vatican City, Bannon said that the Judeo-Christian West has a long history of struggle with Islam, and that today the two civilizations are involved in a global existential war. This is actually an empowered person saying this, not just some crackpot on the street corner. He said, "We are," and I'm quoting, "at the beginning stages of a very brutal and bloody conflict," and I'm still quoting, "if the people in this room," 2014, a meeting in Vatican City, it wasn't a Vatican-sponsored event, but it was in Vatican City, "if the people in this room, the people of the church, do not bind together and really form what I feel is an aspect of the church militant, and really be able to not just stand with our beliefs, but to fight for our beliefs against this new barbarity that is starting, that will completely eradicate everything that we've been bequeathed over the past 2,500 years." Yes, that was not a sentence, but I'm quoting. That is what he said. You can Google it. It's still up on YouTube. And that was 5 years ago. And despite the horrific loss of life and quality of life and patent failure to achieve its stated objectives, today the ideologically framed global war on terror threatens to expand yet again, this time to Iran. In January 2018, former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, he's still alive, amazingly enough, former US Secretary of State, he told the Senate Armed Services Committee that Iran is seeking to take over the entire Middle East. The U.S. therefore must lead its allies against this threat just as it led them during the Cold War, when the U.S. vanquished the threat of Soviet ideology, not power, ideology. This is a view apparently shared by current White House appointees, such as National Security Council advisor John Bolton and his hand-picked staff, as evidenced in their belligerent stance towards Iran. So to conclude, first, just to put your mind at ease, Muslims do not have fundamentally different values from those of Jews and Christians and others. And they do not hate our freedoms. Just trust me. They do not. That was fantasy. Those who oppose the Euro-American West do so largely because of our role in depriving people of those freedoms. The core grievances that have given rise to radicalization have remained consistent since the betrayal of our promises of freedom made at the outset of the Great War. The Great War, in which 2.5 million Muslims participated on our side. 2.5 million Muslims who were still under mainly British but also partly French colonial control participated on our side, assuming that we were all fighting for the same freedoms. Even President Bush recognized and acknowledged that not all Muslims are fanatics. But that distinction seems to be lost in today's expanding war on terror. It is therefore critically important to recognize the dangerous consequences of framing political conflicts as fundamentally ideological in nature. The arrangements made at the end of the Great War created conditions that saw the rise both of European fascism and militant organizations throughout the formerly colonized world. But just as we didn't end fascism or anti-Semitism or communism with wars, we're unlikely to cure terrorism with wars. If we don't address the causes, we cannot cure the symptoms. So let us lay to rest with Professors Pipes, Lewis, and Huntington their deeply flawed theories of ideological warfare and clashing civilizations, and focus instead on the facts of shared human values and aspirations for a decent standard of living, basic liberties, and dignity. Let us stop celebrating military conflict, military victories, and focus instead on resolving conflicts. Let us, at long last, put an end to the Great War. Thank you.